240 manuscripts chosen among the finest and most characteristic of private or state collections, and notably from the French National Library, are exhibited together with a small number of works borrowed from abroad. These happen to be of great value to our understanding of the most important artists. Considering the huge amount of works, we decided to concentrate on the undisputed masterpieces. Our purpose isn't to give a lecture about French history or merely to follow the exhibition's catalog. We'll just let you discover these masterpieces as no book could, bring you the colors and the gildings with unequaled fidelity, traveling through the paintings in search of details our eyes don't always notice. Our method is very simple. A selection of the most beautiful works, following the exhibition's order and passing through the different regions where artistic production flourished after the end of Parisian hegemony. In this period, France witnesses 20 years of exceptional artistic activity in the context of the refined movement we call International Gothic or Court Style. Its most eminent representatives are the Master of Boucicaut, the Limbourg brothers, and the Master of Bedford in Paris, followed later in the provinces by the Master of Rohan and the Master of Marguerite d'Orléans, who made the transition between the two periods. Now, let us take a look at these masters' productions. Paris' most important artist in the early 15th century, while still following the elegant line of court style, uses his knowledge of the Italian Trecento paintings in the remarkable spatial organization of his compositions. His realistic observation of details announces the great Dutch painter's researches. He likes to represent indoor scenes in an open architecture in the foreground, and a small window in the background adds to the light-dark effect. This precisely drawn scene where the minister Étonne offers the Duke of Burgundy, Jean Sans Peur, his History of the East is a good example. With luxurious colors and motives, the margin gives the painting a rich frame. The last work added to this manuscript, this famous miniature, has been done by one of the Limbourg brothers, probably Jean, in 1412. It shows the old Duke of Berry leaving a fortified town to go on what seems to be a pilgrimage, as we can suppose by the staff he holds in his hand. The exquisite counterpoint of colors, the pious theme, the precision in the detail of the costumes inform us about the different requirements of the Limbourg's art. This painting and all the other paintings that the three brothers did for the Duke give us a very precise idea of the complicity they shared with their protector and their tremendous effort to satisfy the expectations of this most extraordinary patron of the arts. This manuscript, a breviary with 712 pages, probably had 120 more to it originally. It's one of the most impressive productions of Parisian bookmaking during the regency of John of Lancaster for the Duke of Bedford, who ordered the work. In most of the breviary's big miniatures, we notice this density of detail, this taste for complex compositions revealing a horror of emptiness, this absence of rhythmic aeration, the arbitrary structural logic that we already know from the Hours of Bedford. The scene of Christ entering Jerusalem, although finished by a collaborator, holds on to its stylistic bias, but the bigger size of the miniature allows larger compositions, the pictorial execution has evolved, the brushstroke has broadened, and the drawing is less accurate. The shapes have rounded off and the volumes have concentrated, as if the painter had felt the evolution taking place in the north, in Tournai and Bruges. This manuscript proves that the Master of Bedford and his followers were very attentive to the advances of the great Dutch masters. The great Hours of Rohan owe their name to the large Breton family's arms that frequently appear in this manuscript. Rohan's part in this work are all the big paintings, with two exceptions. Although all the others stem from several collaborators, the artist imposed his own personal touch to the entire manuscript. The full-page paintings he did himself, or closely supervised, show the Master of Rohan's temper. The arms that often appear on the pages allow us to identify Marguerite of Orleans as the book's addressee. We immediately notice the influence of the Master of Boucicaut in the 41 pages of this manuscript. The old Parisian master indeed inspired most of the compositions. But it's the very imaginative borders that prove the decorative genius of the artist. A whole crowd of small characters full of vitality liven up the borders of these scenes of unprecedented invention and dynamism. A whole section of medieval culture comes to life in this microcosmos. (1415 to 1420). A sudden succession of historic events shakes up French artistic life. Paris loses its central role, and new creative centers, new schools, and new aspirations appear in provincial cities. Nevertheless, the activity of the Master of Bedford's workshop doesn't decrease even after his death. For one of his collaborators, the main associate we call the Master of Dunois, will keep the workshop activity going well into the second half of the century, keeping its traditions alive. The narrative penchant of Bedford's associate led him to illustrate many secular books where he can freely express his taste for anecdote, for contemporary clothing and animated description. The novel by Guiron was completed by an associate who painted around 30 tiny miniatures in the first and 2 big ones in the beginning of the second volume. These miniatures, with very courtly or chivalrous themes, are often displayed in big green, fresh landscapes. Besides an iconography inherited from the Master of Bedford, this manuscript shows the main associate's smooth features. These more round shapes used for the faces, and these drapes, these blurred outlines that call for the backing of a black line. Between 1440 and 1500, 2 triads of artists work at the same time with a remarkable continuity over 3 generations. The first to have been discovered and studied were the Master of Jean Rollin and Master François, later followed on by the Master of Jacques de Besançon, whom we'll study in the second chapter. This manuscript is the masterpiece of this well-known Parisian artist, famous for the many missals he illuminated for the Cardinal Jean Rollin. The Master of Jean de Rollin is one of the first artists to free himself from the non-realistic style of International Gothic with a more energetic stroke and brightly contrasted colors, as well as a new concern for dramatic expression. On the cover of this pious treaty, hanging in the sky, we see a knight on whose armor has been painted the arms of a Breton duke addressing the reader, while on the opposite page the Dominican author points him out to his audience with an important gesture. One of the few miniaturists to have been known by his name, or at least his first name, Master Francois, holds an important place in the history of illumination, justified by the abundance and the quality of his works. The historical compendium is a magnificent and very carefully made manuscript. This page strikes us particularly for the colorful intensity and the dense and bright use of color. Master Francois orders his composition with a very strong contrast between dominant dark hues and the bright yellow and orange of infernal flames. The second triad includes the Master of Drebudet, the Master of Cotivy, followed at the end of the century by the Master of Anne de Bretagne. In his only miniature at the forefront of this book, the Master of Drebudet gives this subject a powerful interpretation. The rebelling angels, already turned into demons, fall into a rocky abyss of sparkling flames or bluish waters. God on the throne at the center of three concentric choirs of adoring angels, thinly painted onto the colored backgrounds that are covered by a mass of menacing dark clouds. The originality of this page comes from the extraordinary representation of light, from the contrast between the clarity of divine vision and the abysmal darkness where yellow flames still shoot up. Contrary to his habit, the Master of Cotivy, who was in charge of the entire decoration, ignored the text he was to illustrate. He draws from the traditional French medieval iconography to picture hell, purgatory, and paradise without real link to Dante's text. Paradise, with its fresh and lively colors, offers a new picture of celestial court. It seems to be less stiff than the first triad's representation, with its concentric circles of angels and its saints turned toward God. This middle-sized book of Hours bears very few ornaments, and its excellent miniatures are only decoration. The same work shows us the two different types of frame which can be encountered in the third quarter of the century. The new type with compartments appears quite well on this page. The background is either gilded with flowers or left blank with blue and pink motifs, without a decorative band. In this new compartmentalization, the artist proves an inventive wit far from dry routine. (1435 to 1465), the northern region is not politically united, but is a pattern of neighboring towns. This proximity brings the local illuminators to work together, and their very homogeneous production speaks for a true local artistic school. Let's begin with the Master of Mansel. His name originates from his work on La Fleur des Histoires, written by Jean Mansel de Hesdin, and in which most drawings are by his hand. The Master of Mansel represents the link between his native Amiens tradition of the 1430s and the glorious generation of Simon Marmion. His technique is more advanced in all aspects. He does less submissive copying and often modernizes costumes and hairstyles. We notice the beauty of his touch, how he shapes forms and surfaces, gives them life with many small colored brush strokes. His favorite colors are a very rare raspberry pink and bright blue, as well as a systematic coexistence of vermilion and light green. His skies are crowded with silver dwindling clouds that will become characteristic of his school, and one often notices a hill in the background bearing a church tower. Then came Simon Marmion, who settled down in Valenciennes in 1458 until his death in 1489. He worked as an illustrator and as a painter in the entire region and was called the Prince of Illumination. Simon Marmion displays his scenes with an extraordinary skill. In the background of the narrative scenes, we see vast and deep landscapes where dark and mysterious battles are fought. The charm of these pages stems from the association of imagined sights and concretely detailed characters. He knows how to use space as a compositional means. The picturesque richness of color and contemporary costume described in every detail and the quality of texture bring an additional refinement to these lavish scenes of cautious spontaneity. Unknown until 1972, Philippe Le Bon's prayer book is a work of incredible artistic complexity. Simon Marmion did only one of the 50 miniatures in the book, The Crucifixion. The composition is divided into two groups of 3 static characters on each side of the cross. The landscape is very soft, bearing little contrast, going from a pale yellow-green to a very smooth gray area, where we notice a town and then a blue hill with a castle on the top. The pale blue sky is horizontally striped with small white clouds. The worn miniature is soft, faded in typically muffled tones of a slate gray or lavender. He uses unusually dull shades as the purplish carmine red of St. John's costume or the centurion's garment. Working in the exact following of Simon Marmion, the second master of the Great Chronicles deserves an individual acknowledgement. His technique is unique to him. Light paint barely covering, as if brushed with a pencil, leaves over lighter parts, which produces reflections with very little means. This particular craft gives his paintings a great refinement, with this softness and stumped finish. This charming miniature is set next to a prayer addressed to Saint Anne. As the second master of the Great Chronicles, the master of Aristotle's Ethics worked in the tradition of Simon Marmion. In this manuscript, the characters wearing allegorical spirits are depicted in a casual way with an impressively realistic touch. We notice the role of money as a measure of commercial trade, which leads to a cheerful representation of 3 colorful shops and their customers. The finish of the border is typical of the regional spirit, with its garlands and leaves intertwining symmetrically and the beautiful bouquets of flowers and its birds. This artist is the last of the northern illustrators whom we can associate with Simon Marmion's artistic milieu. In this manuscript, only this superb dedication scene was made by the master of Rambourg. We recognize the choice of blue and red counterpoint in contrast with a light and broad landscape. The rare color of the translator's robe while he offers his book is achieved by superimposing the artist's two favorite colors, dark blue, on a red background. The borders are more in a Parisian style, but looser, as found in Bruges. This one bears the device, Pour jamais, surrounding a grenade. We also see the unidentified monogram, RT. All manuscripts by the Count of Artois, with almost no exception, are simply drawn on paper. All superfluous ornament is banned from the very sober composition where only the picture interacts with the text. The setting confines itself to modest filigrane initials. With a few essential strokes and in the most impressive manner, the master of John of Valverin manages to restore the atmosphere of this novel that tells the adventures of the Count of Artois' wife. The technique of illustration, surprisingly original, is incisive and caustic. The dynamic gesture of the little ink drawings set off with a light wash is not without connection to the art of today's best cartoonists. With its 179 pictures, this manuscript from Martin Lefranc is the most richly illustrated. It's an interesting cycle that is outstanding by its iconographic conception as well as by style and technical execution. What is most striking is the artist's powerfully plastic and dynamic rendering of shapes and space. Of palpable density, characters, architecture, and landscapes are brought down to their essential volumes. The enhanced gestures, the toppled perspectives of interiors, all proceed from the same research of intense expression. This fanciful painter is nevertheless a realistic observer, able to depict neatly the details of his era. The noble address of this manuscript is stressed out by a full-page front-page illustration representing Martin Lefranc as he hands his work over to Philippe Le Bon. Except for the heraldic setting, which is quite ornamental, this classic scene of dedication differs much from other known presentation scenes featuring the Duke of Burgundy. The artist didn't try to represent a real scene, but with the two allegories on each side of the Duke, he insists on the Duke's leadership qualities and his position as head of the Golden Fleece Order. Although of short duration, an intense artistic activity takes place in these regions from 1440 to 1470. The master of Barthélemy Lenglet appears as an isolated and mysterious artist, staying apart from the artistic movements of his time. Behind impressive appearances, he is a latecomer. Even if he intends to use his time's new realism, he only achieves the ancient form of two-dimensional representation without true illusion of depth. On the other hand, he carefully paints the shape of his faces, not with a real chiaroscuro, but by stressing of their features. Using bright and contrasted colors and contrasting lightings, he demonstrates a deep sense of physical presence. Angers quickly becomes the turntable of a group of artists we call the Jouvenel group, after Guillaume de Jouvenel des Ursins, Chancellor of France, for whom they illustrated this huge manuscript. It includes one of the most ambitious projects known in illustration, which provided years of work for the finest artists in illumination, the master of Jouvenel, the master of Geneva's Boccaccio, and the master of Boès. This other work of the Angers team was commissioned by the Duke of Burgundy, Philippe le Hardi. It was started by the Limbourg brothers, was interrupted by the Duke's death, but completed 60 years later by the master of Geneva's Boccaccio. Had it been completed, this ambitious work would have counted 5,000 pictures. The illustrations are directly inspired from another more ancient moralized Bible, which was executed by the commissioner's father, Jean Le Bon. This other manuscript is one of the most typical works by the third distinguished artist of the Jouvenel triad, the master of Boès. As in La Mer des Histoires, he demonstrates the ease with which he does big-sized drawings. Here, Cupid storms the castle in which Belle Écosse is held prisoner. We see him sitting under a blue canopy surrounded by his army. On the right, Faux-Semblant, dressed as a monk, and Abstinence, severely draped in black. In the center, two elegant young ladies from Love's party stand by the tower, armed with spears and ready to attack in order to free Belle Écosse. This artist, one of the most original of his generation, can be recognized by his way of representing landscapes in successive, plain-shaded layers, lacking all notion of depth, by his geometrical shapes, his fresh and subtle color, as well as his powerful opposition of frank colors. He shows a great interest in light and composes either serene blue or sunset skies. The 10 big full-page paintings gathered at the beginning of this manuscript form a complete cycle of the Passion. The artist enriched it by putting together several episodes on the same page following the principle of simultaneous narration. The pictorial treatment with dull, hardly sketched shades and the absence of transparent shades hush up all effect of spatial depth and create an opaque space quite typical of this illustrator. The greatest French painter and illustrator of the 15th century emerges in Tours as this city becomes the capital. Famous in his time, Jean Fouquet is a painter who also illustrates manuscripts, and Tours' illumination is closely bound to his fame. The perfect shape of his Virgin Mary in blue contrasts with the red background. It is framed with gold to emphasize its value as an image of devotion. This miniature offers a complex play of colors between several subtle blue shades and red masses. The use of golden motifs or dots to produce the shape of the Virgin's blue coat, the round and full faces, as well as the broken and swollen draping, the tubular foldings are as unique as an artist's signature. When Jean Fouquet works on an historic theme, he puts the official aspect forward, identifying it with the monarchy's ceremonies rather than the battles, as here in this homage. More than detailed precision, the artist seeks to express a general truth and make out the meaning of the related events. The meaning of the scene, by the use of fundamental heraldic colors, is given a symbolic atmosphere rather than a realistic description. In this other manuscript, instead of a composition based on a few main characters, the artist multiplies figures and diminishes their scale, so as to merge the individuals in gray-brown clouds that stand in these endless and majestic landscapes occupying two-thirds of the picture. The impression of open air and perspective, which is a new feature in illumination of this era, are delivered by the graduation of colors and the washed-out shades in the distance. Fouquet adds to this a mastery of disposing human bodies according to a new unity of place and time. The palette itself is different. The colors have become softer, the sky is lightened with white, and the liquid gold of the garments is muffled. This page of very sober finish surprises by the greatness of its conception and the simple beauty of its disposition. It is a brilliant exercise as regards the colors. The composition is entirely based on shades of white, which was the artist's favorite color. The diversity of materials and the composition of lighting is rendered with virtuosity. Only the discreet glow of gold on a small luminous shutter and a few pages of heraldic azure and the red and black accents of the knight's festive costumes compete with the white areas. The golden window reflects the golden red ink used to write the text, harmonizing with the gold monochrome at the bottom of the page. This manuscript includes 2 big and 8 small images framed with rich borders of blue and gold motifs. The painter, identified as the master of the Yale's Missal, is in the continuity of Fouquet, who often uses his iconographic models, but his paintings are done in very matte shades of little contrast, almost dull, based on light olive, green and strong azure, dead pink and crushed raspberry, while the skies are lavender blue and often turning mauve. Most characteristic is his constant use of liquid matte gold for whole dresses or broad architectural settings. It is difficult to speak of Bourges as a living center of illumination. Until 1470, patrons brought in artists coming from other regions. This is the case with Charles of France, Louis XI's brother. This manuscript, transcribed on a gross parchment, seems to have been done in a hurry. The first 2 miniatures of the work are the only ones entirely painted. They use the principle of simultaneous narration, which allows the artist to put 2 episodes together in the same space, forcing him to depict very small characters. This painting tells us the story of Merlin's birth and shows him being baptized. The last scene is the one of Merlin's mother's trial. She's accused of witchcraft according to the stake prepared and the curious crowd. The imagination that unfolds in this book is not without charm. It permits the representation of scenes of daily life in a familiar way. As well as by the elements of the creation, such as this globe covered with oceans and crossed by rivers. Around 1450, Rouen, economic and ecclesiastical capital, prevails as a dominant center. The dynamism of its libraries discourages all competition. Rouen's patrons actively supported the workshops over at least 20 years. The master of the Rouen is recognizable by his taste for clearly ordered compositions and his smooth and precise drawing. In his outdoor scenes, he likes to gather several episodes in the same space and distributes them in a harmonious way, as in this painting showing at the same time the construction of Venice, Sicambria, Carthago, and Rome. The artist likes to stress the folding of drapes and the grimacing mask of human faces. Made for the patron of Rouen, this manuscript makes the transition to other techniques that will later tend to give the characters more monumental dimensions by unifying the setting. This work is closest to this idea and represents the young Richard I, son of William Longsword, Duke of Normandy. A doctor who furthermore had Louis XI's trust, Chouanet sent the monarch this little moral poem bearing praise for good government. While enumerating all kinds of hunting techniques, the author flatters the shepherd king protecting his flock from wild animals. In these paintings, the master of Rouen proves his gift of composition and his sobriety in narration. The different elements are clearly drawn and articulated. Their shape, dry and without depth, seems rejected by the page's surface in compositions where depth is reduced to the decorative effect. This hour book is doubtlessly one of the most fascinating productions of Breton illumination during the first half of the 15th century. The cause of this is the superior stylistic originality and the iconographic creativity the artist demonstrates. In these blissful views of the Virgin Mary, these scenes of Jesus' birth seem to point out that the artist got his inspiration far from his usual artistic surrounding. The painting below shows Joseph trying to catch the young Jesus' attention as he takes his first steps. This unusual cycle of paintings is made in an unprecedented style of Breton illustration. The artist vacillates between a sharp and detailed observation of the real world with portraits of cruel veracity, and a tendency for geometrization of forms and stylization of nature, which confers his compositions a native charm. This charm is enhanced by singing colors and fresh tones that give the most dramatic scenes a luminous serenity. This scene of the siege of the Derival Castle by Louis d'Anjou and the famous Chevalier de Guerlain shows a very true-to-life representation of the commissioner's castle, and yet, although the true details gather in a laborious way, the whole scene bathes in an imaginary and poetic atmosphere, which is reinforced by the simplified treatment of the vegetation and the landscape. These two regions have opposing ideas, for while Champagne continuously follows the Parisian style, Lorraine clings to its originality, and its influences stem rather from the other side of the Rhine. These three manuscripts are part of a work of 7 volumes holding the entire Franciscan commentary on biblical books. The big central scene that introduces the first volume shows the divine world with a tiny God surrounded by 7 rows of angels. Below, the earthly world, delightfully microcosmic, where the Garden of Eden and original sin are represented with supreme delicacy. The earth is surrounded by the ocean and the air, inhabited by birds and insects, followed by the 7 circles of Ptolemaic cosmography. In the 6 medallions on the left margin are depicted the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, facing on the other side the 12 prophets. The heroes of Christianity are grouped under 4 arcades in the lower border. In the vegetal motifs of his frames, the artist likes to include the symbol of the beneficiary and plenty of animals, among which a small rabbit that is effectively his signature. This manuscript was illustrated by the master of Michaud Le Pellet. Instead of a portrait of the author or of narrative episodes usually heading the text, this work was given a 4-page dedicated with heraldic symbols. In the middle of a closed garden blooms a gigantic lily to which the French écu, held by 2 angels, is attached. The decoration in this work is made by 2 artists with very different styles. The scenes painted by the first illustration differ from the usual conventions, For example, in this Annunciation, the dove of the Holy Spirit, instead of coming out of God's mouth, emerges from a huge flame in a lunar setting. Whereas the author's style is quite poor and rudimentary, the execution is extraordinarily meticulous. The shapes are drawn with an almost metallic dryness, with little relief, and this produces an unmistakable expressive power. This book's artistic value is remarkable as it throws a new light on that era's commissioned paintings. In the Gallery of Saints he was ordered to draw, the master eluded all monotony. It is clear that this artist is a stranger to the local artistic tradition and that his style originates from the pictorial culture that develops in Germany in the region of the Middle Rhine, Alsace, and Souabe.